Good morning and welcome to the Lead Registrant webinar. I am joined today by my colleagues Tatiana Netseva and Laura Rossi, and we have the Lead Registrant webinar for you. It's a lovely day in Helsinki. It's -8 degrees and the sun is shining, so a good welcome to this event. Okay, so what we're going to do is go through an introduction. I'm going to talk about the audio broadcast, how you can interact in this event, and how to deal with questions and answers. Let's start with the audio broadcast. When you join the event, you will automatically be connected to the audio broadcast. There is a panel that opens and you should be able to control the audio volume. We encourage you to make sure that the sounds system is working on your computer so that you can use either speakers or a headset. You can listen to the broadcast, but you can't speak to us. You can't speak directly to participants. Communication happens by way through the question and answers feature that's available. And let me just show you how that works. This shows you what's happening in the event. The panelists are listed in the panel that you can see to the left. If you have a question, you have to type it into the question and answer box. It's important you ask all the panelists, so use the drop-down list and select all panelists before you send in your question. And then when your question is ready and you want to send it in, if you hit the send button, it will then come into us and we'll then have a look at your answer and reply. So this provides you with a way of interacting. You can submit questions via this panel between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock. We will respond to your questions, and we may do so by 3 ways. We can either respond directly to you using the question and answer panel. If it's slightly more complex an issue, we will phone you after the webinar. Or alternatively, if we can't answer the question immediately, we will follow the formal route of going through the ECHA help desk. So, the things to note here, if you do submit a question, it's important that you monitor the question and answer panel for our response. You need to remain logged into the webinar, and it remains open until 2 o'clock. So that's 1 hour after the last presentation. If we call you, we will tend to call you after the webinar, after our presentations have finished. We will tell you via the question and answer panel that we will call you, and we will propose a time slot for you. We will also ask you to confirm your phone number. The ECHA help desk provides support on ECHA's IT tools and REACH and CLP obligations. So you can also submit questions to the ECHA help desk contact, and that's the web link that's given there. And select an appropriate option depending on the nature of your question. So there you should receive acknowledgement of your question and an answer within 15 working days. So that covers how you interact with us. And now I'm just going to cover briefly the contents of the program today. This is the introduction that we're dealing with now. And after that, immediately, I'll start speaking on the issue of weight of evidence as an adaptation for the information requirements. We will then, after that talk, have a 15-minute break. And then my colleague Laura will speak about using in vitro data to fill REACH information requirements. And then subsequently, Tatiana will speak about the use of QSARs for REACH. Then we will finalize with a summary, key messages, and conclusions at the end of all that. Again, important, you can type in your questions up to 1 o'clock, so at the end of the seminar, but we will then answer questions for another hour after the presentations have finished. I will now start on the presentation on weight of evidence, which is an adaptation that's available in Annex 11 in REACH. My name is David Bell. So what I'm going to cover in this session is the concept of weight of evidence. What is it and when it can be used within REACH? I'm going to cover what you need to do if you're going to use weight of evidence. How do you build a case under weight of evidence? I'm going to cover how you present this case in a dossier, how you present it in Euclid, and then finalize with some conclusions. So let us start off with the concept and what it means in REACH. This is Annex 11, Section 1.2. This is the legal text that defines what weight of evidence is and when you can use it as an adaptation for the information requirements. So this legal text is our guide. Let me go through some of the particular issues that arise from this legal text. When you look at the first paragraph, you can see that it says there may be sufficient weight of evidence. And the key issue here is that it's from several independent sources of information. And these independent sources of information lead to the assumption or to the conclusion that a substance has or doesn't have a particular dangerous property. And a key issue here is that the information from each individual source alone may not be sufficient to come to a conclusion on the chemical. So that's one of the first issues about weight of evidence, that you bring together information from multiple sources. A second aspect of this relates to the idea that there may be sufficient weight of evidence from the use of newly developed test methods, which aren't yet internationally recognized test methods, but they may enable us to come to the conclusion that a substance does or does not have a particular dangerous property. When you are able to come to a conclusion using weight of evidence, that means that you can avoid testing on vertebrate animals, and that testing not involving vertebrate animals may be omitted. But a key aspect of this is that adequate and reliable documentation shall be provided. So it's very important that there's actually enough information that we can see how you've come to your conclusion about the weight of evidence, and that actually documents what the evidence is that you're basing your judgment about. So that's the legal text, and that is a starting position. And then the next question is, when can we apply this weight of evidence approach? And one scenario is that the weight of evidence concept applies when you have multiple sources of less reliable information, and that by pulling them together with other information, you can make a sufficient weight of evidence. And I give you one example here at a very high level, but just to illustrate the idea. So for example, if we have an information requirement where we have to do a prenatal developmental toxicity test for a substance, we may know that the substance undergoes instantaneous degradation at the site of contact with the body. We may also know that the breakdown products from the chemical have been tested and they do not cause prenatal developmental toxicity, even at high dose. In this hypothetical situation, we could construct a weight of evidence argument that there is no need to test the parent substance for reproductive toxicity, because the substance doesn't get into the body, it breaks down, and the breakdown products are also known to be safe. And this illustrates several of the key issues to do with weight of evidence analysis. The individual bits of evidence by themselves are not sufficient to act as a waiver. Instantaneous breakdown at the site of entry isn't enough, but you need to have another bit of evidence that the breakdown products aren't toxic either. And then you can make the weight of evidence. It also illustrates the idea that this is very specific both to the substance and to the end point. So for example here, this applies for prenatal developmental toxicity, but you might still have an outstanding need to test repeated dose toxicity because this breakdown at the site of contact with the body might cause toxicity in itself. So there's an issue about this being site-specific, multiple sources of evidence, and also there will be considerable judgment involved in evaluating the evidence at each stage and seeing whether it is adequate for the purpose. So that is, as I say, an example. This is perhaps a little bit more rigorous, a cartoon of looking at the places where we can apply weight of evidence. If we start at the top of this diagram, the first question is, are adequate studies available? If there is one adequate study available, which is the left-hand tree, then you simply have a key study, and that is, as you were, is the normal approach. Likewise, if you have more than one adequate study, it may be that you have one key study, and then the rest of the information is simply supporting information. Here, again, you don't need to use weight of evidence. However, if you have more than one adequate study available, and there is either different information from those studies or conflicting information from these studies, then you will have to balance that information from the multiple studies. And here, these are the two boxes ringed in the middle. You have to use a weight of evidence approach, where you have to set out what the evidence is and how you balance up that evidence. So weight of evidence can be used when you have multiple studies. But additionally, as you see at the top, if no single study by itself is adequate, you may still be able to use multiple less reliable studies. So this is where you go off to the right-hand side tree and bring that information together to provide a weight of evidence approach which answers the information requirement. So this is a more detailed exposition of the ways that you can use weight of evidence. In using weight of evidence, a key issue is evaluating the evidence which you're basing your opinion upon. And there are multiple issues involved in evaluating that information. I bring to your attention these parameters: the reliability, the adequacy, the relevance, and the quantity of information. So first of all, reliability is the quality of the study. And a frequently used method for evaluating the reliability is the Klimisch score. So this is the inherent quality of a test report or publication. To communicate the reliability, there are a series of scores which can be given, ranging from 1, reliable without restrictions, to reliable with restriction, not reliable, or not assignable, where you aren't able to evaluate what value it might have. So evaluating the reliability of information in the first instance is clearly a key issue. Next is relevance, and this covers the extent to which data and tests are appropriate for a particular hazard identification or risk characterization. So for example, the relevance of the test material. Does it meet the specifications of your substance is one simple question. The relevance of the test method and the conditions. It's sometimes a matter where you have to check out if the method and conditions are helpful for the information requirement. The relevance of the endpoint. So it's a frequent issue that you can get unexpected physical effects at high dose. So physical effects aren't necessarily illustrative of a real toxic effect, but rather that you've used too high a concentration, and it isn't something that we worry about. And also we have the relevance of alternative methods, which may be entirely fit for purpose. Adequacy is a slightly different issue insofar as you're trying to establish the usefulness of the information for hazard and risk assessment. And just to illustrate what I mean, for risk assessment, one of the key issues that we want is a no observed adverse effect level. If all of your test concentrations cause severe toxicity, for example, you haven't established a no effect level, and that's a key parameter. Likewise, you can ask the very simple question, is this information useful for classification and labeling? Does it answer the particular concerns of the classification and labeling legislation? So this is another lens through which you must view your data. Finally, the quantity of data can be important. If you have multiple independent sources of data saying the same thing, that is also important information used in weighting the information. Weight of evidence involves an evidence-based approach, and you have to get the data and then assess the relative weights of the different pieces of information. And this can sometimes involve looking at strengths and the weaknesses of the data. It is case-dependent, very specific to the substance, and specific to the endpoint, as I've already tried to illustrate. The use of weight of evidence is influenced by a number of things, including the amount of information that you need, the importance of the decision that you're taking, and the likelihood of and the consequences for the decision being wrong. A key issue overriding or overarching this is the issue of expert judgment, that you've got to balance all this in an expert way, knowing what the issues are that you're dealing with. Okay, these are some of the outline considerations, but how do we perform a weight of evidence? Well, a first step is to gather all the relevant information. And this obviously will depend on the particular endpoint, but handbooks and the literature may provide a large amount of relevant and important information. Specific databases are available for providing information on chemicals of various sorts. And you also have another couple of options, for example, read across. You can read across to other chemicals and use that in a weight of evidence approach. QSAR, again, is a methodology that's quite applicable in this circumstance. In the case of studies of variable reliability, you can use studies at Klimisch score 2, 3, and 4. So studies that would by themselves be not reliable may, in a weight of evidence consideration, be able to be taken into account. So that's an important consideration that you can look at those. You can look at newly developed test methods, and you can also look at epidemiological studies and other human data. So the first step here is to gather all this information and other relevant information as appropriate so that you can evaluate it. Then you have to assess the data. It's a prerequisite that you have to have 2 or more pieces of information. But then you have to step through all of these issues. You have to look at whether the information is relevant to the endpoint. You have to look to see if there's adequate documentation of the studies. You have to look at the reliability and the weight that you put on each piece of data. Is there consistency in the results, or do we have conflicting information, and why? And at the end, you're going to have to come to a view on whether the combined weight is substantial. In other words, when you put all the information together, is that more than the individual pieces of information by themselves? And it's this aspect here that is key. You're drawing a conclusion using expert judgment. So it's a matter of integrating and comparing the different pieces of information. You have to justify the weights that you're assigning to each piece of data. You can say that some information is good and some information is bad, but you have to justify why you say that. You should be taking into account the reliability, the relevance, the adequacy, and the quantity of data. So, expert judgment is key in the construction and appraisal of this weight of evidence package. That brings us on to another issue, and that is the issue of adequate and reliable documentation. You've got to document in your dossier, in the Euclid file, adequate documentation for each piece of evidence. So that means an endpoint study and record in Euclid for every piece of information. You have to flag the information as a weight of evidence and prepare robust study summaries for each study that's included. You have to record the reliability score, and one option is to consider flagging some of these studies as a supporting study instead. But as a minimum, you need one complete endpoint study record, and that is always required. A key study, a waiver with justification and weight of evidence. And then you have to have an endpoint study summary to document the conclusion on weight of evidence and the justification for using this evidence instead of standard testing. I think I point out that this adequate and reliable documentation is key. You've got to set out your reasoning, and ECHA has to be able to understand that reasoning. So if the reasoning isn't given, we can't follow what your reasoning is. And this is important because we have to evaluate whether the requirements of the Annex 11 1.2 are met. So we need to have sufficient detail provided so that we can evaluate the evidence in an unbiased way. We've got to be able to have sufficient detail to look at it properly. We need to be able to look at the combined information and see whether that allows for a conclusion to be drawn on the relevant endpoint. And the process of arriving at your judgment has to be clearly documented. You've got to explain why you think some things are weighted in such a way, or why you think there's a combined weight of evidence that is substantial. So documenting what you think, what you've thought, what your reasoning is a key issue, and it must be done in the Euclid file and the CSR. If I can just briefly show you what this means in practice in a Euclid file, this is an example of what a Euclid file looks like when you're using weight of evidence. In the endpoint study record, you can see that this has been flagged as a weight of evidence study. A robust study summary has been provided. And then, as you can see from below, there's a great deal of relevant detail which is needed for evaluating the relevant study. As we go down the endpoint study record, you can see more information giving all the relevant detail which you need to evaluate this particular study. Now, as you can see in the left field, there's a endpoint summary, and there are two endpoint study records. So the endpoint summary is where you justify your weighted evidence conclusions. So you explain why you've got different information, what that is, what all your considerations were in coming to a weight of evidence view. So that's what we would expect to see in a Euclid file. So I wish to conclude, and that is to say that weighted evidence is a very useful approach which is allowed in the legal text in Annex 11 1.2 to enable you to fulfill information requirements. It has the benefit of making use of all the available information for an endpoint, but it does require expert judgment, and it is very much a case-specific issue. And to use it, you have to provide clear and transparent documentation and argument that sets out how you've come to your conclusions, and all the relevant data has to be provided. So I've covered what weighted evidence is, how you use it. There's a great deal more information available in guidance. Some of these links here may be useful to you if you want to further explore this. There's obviously the webinar material which is available to you, but also we have a large amount of guidance available on the ECHA website on information requirements and chemical safety assessment using this sort of approach. And there's also a specific guidance that is available on weight of evidence, and you should read that if you're going to be applying this. Finally, I draw your attention to the evaluation progress reports, which are an annual report from ECHA. These provide feedback on what we've been finding in dossiers that we've evaluated over the last year, and that includes information on how best to use specific adaptation options, such as, for example, weight of evidence.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you back to our webinar. My name is Laura Rossi, and I will be talking about how you can use in vitro data to fulfill your REACH information requirements. So here is the overview of my presentation. First, I will go briefly through the REACH and in vitro methods and how they fit together. Then I will highlight some aspects to consider for you if you want to use in vitro methods. Followed by the internationally validated and regulatory accepted methods and how they can be used. Then I will go through a bit more in detail how you can fulfill the information requirements with in vitro data according to the Annex 11 1.4 criteria. Then I will have a practical example how you can submit in vitro data when an in vivo data is normally required. Then at the end of my presentation, I will just highlight what experiences we have had so far with in vitro methods and what lays in the future of in vitro methods. Then at the end of my presentation, I have collected some useful links for you where you can find some additional information. One of the aims of the REACH regulation is that vertebrate animal testing should only be used as a last resort. And the in vitro methods are part of the 3R strategy within REACH. And the 3Rs stands for replacing, reducing, and refining animal testing and promoting alternative methods. The REACH regulation already has several in vitro methods within the standard information requirements. For example, for skin irritation, corrosion, and eye irritation endpoints at the Annex 7 level, the information requirements consist solely of in vitro methods. Also, for the endpoint assessing mutagenicity potential at the Annexes 7 and 8 level, the information requirements are also only in vitro methods, which are, for example, the bacterial mutagenicity assay, in vitro chromosome aberration study, and the in vitro gene mutation study on mammalian cells. If you want to use in vitro methods, there are some aspects that you need to consider before doing so. And first aspect is the suitability of the test method. Internationally validated and regulatory accepted in vitro methods, which are included in the European test methods or in the OECD test guidelines, are seen as suitable according to the Annex 11 1.4. We also have this internationally validated test method, but those that have not yet been included into the European test methods or to the OECD test guideline are also seen as suitable. Then we have these in vitro methods that meet the internationally agreed pre-validation criteria. For example, the ECVAM criteria for entering pre-validation can also be seen suitable within the criteria set out in the REACH Annex 11 1.4. One thing that I would like to highlight here is that different methods may be suitable only for certain classes of chemicals, and this is especially true for test assessing eye damage. So it's therefore important for you to select an appropriate test method for your test substance. The second aspect to consider is the adequacy of the data that you have produced. So it has to be fit for your purpose and also useful for the hazard assessment. So it needs to be useful for classification and labeling and or risk assessment. And here is an example. If you have done an in vitro study on skin corrosion and you have obtained a negative result, which means that your substance is non-corrosive, you can't use those results to assess the skin irritation or the non-irritation potential. Therefore, you need to do an additional test assessing the skin irritation potential in vitro. From a regulatory point of view, you can divide in vitro methods into three different categories. The first of them are the validated test method. Those can already be included in the European test method regulation or to the OECD test guidelines. From those test methods, the positive and negative results can be accepted, of course, depending on the scope of the test. The second category are the pre-validated test methods. For example, those that meet the ECVAM criteria for entering pre-validation. From those, we may accept the positive results. And as the last category are those non-pre-validated test methods. Those results can only be used within the weight of evidence approach. But it's useful to know that, for example, if you have done in vitro studies, mechanistical or functional tests, those might be highly useful for you to assess the different properties of your substance. All regulatory approved in vitro methods can be found from the European Test Method Regulation and or from the OECD test guidelines. Those test methods, also those that haven't yet been included in the Test Method Regulation or OECD, can be found from the TAR database, which is the tracking system for alternative test methods. This database is highly useful since you can also find some information about 3R category. For example, if the test method is a full or partial replacement. And it also gives you information about the status of adoption for the European Test Method Regulation or OECD. So if it's considered for adoption or not. The validation of in vitro method is a standardized process, and the scientific validation of a test method is performed according to the internationally agreed validation principles, which you can find from the OECD guidance document 34. Those validated or regulatory accepted in vitro methods, they may fully or partly replace an in vivo test depending on the scope of the test method. For example, one in vitro test may only assess a part of the endpoint required. You can also find the information whether the study is a full or partial replacement from the test guideline itself or from the validation reports. And how you can use in vitro tests, you can also find some useful information from our guidance document R7A, where the integrated testing strategies gives you a stepwise approach on how to fulfill the data requirements. And here I just would like to note that the guidance was published in 2008, so some additional in vitro test methods have been added to or regulatory approved since, but the integrated testing strategy and the rest of the guidance is still highly valid. So now I will go a bit more in detail what is the criteria set in the Annex 11.1.4. So if you have data from a validated and regulatory accepted in vitro method, you can use the Annex 11.1.4 adaptations to fulfill your standard information requirements and avoid to do unnecessary animal testing. If you have in vitro data available from a pre-validated test method, and the result will lead to classification, that means that you have obtained a positive result from that study. For example, in case of skin sensitization, then you can use the Annex 11.1.4 adaptation if you can use the results for self-classification and labeling and or risk assessment purposes. If you have data available from a non-pre-validated test, you can use that information only in the weight of evidence approach with supporting evidence in order to adapt from the standard testing requirements. Here the expert judgment is highly crucial, and it has to include scientifically sound justifications for the adaptations. The Annex 11 also specifies certain conditions when you can use a suitable in vitro method. If the results obtained from a suitable in vitro method indicates a presence of a certain dangerous property, that means that the results were positive. Depending on the potential risk, immediate confirmation requiring testing beyond the information foreseen at the respective tonnage level may be necessary. If you have obtained results using a pre-validated in vitro method, and that indicates the absence of a dangerous property, that means that the results were negative, then the relevant test specified in that annex needs to be carried out, unless these following conditions are met. The test method's scientific validity has been established by an international validation study, and you can use the results for classification and labeling and or risk assessment purposes, and you have provided adequate and reliable documentation of the method that you have used. So that allows us to do an independent assessment of the study. It is highly important for you, if you want to use this Annex 11 1.4 adaptation, to report carefully what protocol you have used. This is due to the fact that the protocol may be modified during the validation process, and these modifications in the protocol may change the performance of the test. You also have to consider the applicability and the limitations specified for a given test method for your substance that you want to use in testing. You should also identify the scope of the test method used. So can it fulfill the information requirement, or is additional in vitro testing needed? For example, in vitro skin corrosion test method does not assess skin irritation potential. All your proposals to adapt from the standard information requirements needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. It is generally accepted that one in vitro study cannot cover, in many cases, endpoints that can be assessed with a single in vivo study. However, if you use a combination of different in vitro methods, those may be used to fulfill the information requirements. As an example here, I would like to bring the skin sensitization endpoint, where there are different in vitro methods being developed to assess different mechanisms of sensitizations. And this test battery is currently under validation. So basically, you have assays there to detect protein binding or dendritic cell activation. And all of these test results need to be assessed together in the weight of evidence approach. But you also have to take the skin penetration potential into account. So now I would like to provide you with a practical example how you can submit in vitro data when an in vivo data is actually a requirement under REACH. And here a good example is the endpoint skin irritation and corrosion, where for substances at or above 10 tons per annum, in vivo test is still a standard information requirement under REACH. However, if you have adequate in vitro data already available for your substance, you should follow these steps. First of all, you have to create an endpoint study record where you waive the in vivo study. This has to be done since otherwise you won't be able to pass the technical completeness check. In this endpoint study record, you also have to justify why you have adapted or waived your standard information requirement. And that could either refer to the column 2 adaptation, if you have already classified based on in vitro studies, or it could refer to the Annex 11 1.4 that you have provided already adequate in vitro studies. But this needs to be defined on a case-by-case basis. Then in addition to that endpoint study record, you have to create separate endpoint study record for each in vitro study that you have. ECHA has already received quite many submissions from validated and pre-validated in vitro methods that mainly have assessed skin and ocular effects. Many of these submissions have been of good quality, and the reporting has included detailed information about the test protocol that has been used if it wasn't accepted to the test method regulation or to the OECD when they did the test. Information about the test conditions, interpretation of the test results, and also conclusions. I would also like to note that we have also received some poor submissions where the reporting was not adequate and we couldn't do an independent assessment of the study. Therefore, we had to go and request more information from the registrant so that we could conclude if the study was adequate or not. The future of in vitro methods is actually quite exciting since new in vitro methods are being validated constantly. There are being, for different endpoints, for example, eye irritation and skin sensitization, new methods are being validated, but also new tests are being developed for different types of substance classes. So basically, when the validation of the test method has been successful, the new test method may be introduced to the OECD test guidelines or to the European test method regulation. And you can find the current validation and the adoption status of the method from the TSAR database. And if you're interested to find more detailed information about the validation of the test method, or what type of test method have been accepted to the validation process, you can find this information from the validation coordinator's website, for example, from the website from ECVAM or ICFAM. So now I would like to summarize that it is possible to use in vitro methods in the REACH context. It's also highly important for you to investigate if there are some possibilities to use an in vitro method for a given substance and endpoint when a vertebrate study is a standard information requirement. How you can use an in vitro method within the REACH context depends on the test method's applicability and the validation status. There are possibilities for you to use the column 2 and Annex 11 adaptations to fulfill your information requirements. And it's also highly important for you to follow the developments of in vitro methods, since new in vitro methods are introduced frequently. So here I have collected some useful links for you if you want to find out some more additional information. For example, the practical guide on how to report in vitro methods, links to the relevant test method regulation, links to the TSAR database, ECVAM and ICFAM websites, and also our guidance documents. I would like to thank you for your attention, and if you have some additional questions, you can contact ECVAM via this website.
My name is Tatiana Netseva. I'm the last speaker in the series of webinars on informational requirements, and my presentation is on regulatory use of QSRs under REACH. In my presentation, I will talk about the QSRs in the context of REACH. We'll describe some conditions for use and scientific validity, and we'll mention some supporting tools and documentation issues. Well, for the first time in the European chemical legislation, REACH allows the use of QSR predictions instead of experimental data to fulfill informational requirements. The QSR predictions could be used also in a weighted evidence approach, as supporting study for an endpoint, or to support read across from analogs or in category. The QSR predictions could be used also in integrating basic strategies to help in deciding on the appropriate testing approach, as well as for grouping, screening, and prioritization. The last bullet point might not be applicable to all registrants, but it's an interesting opportunity for those who handle large chemical inventories. The basic assumptions of the QSR analysis is that biological activity is a function of chemical structure. Or, with other words, the chemical structure is the one that determines also the toxicological effects and all perturbations which happen to a chemical in the living system. Q in brackets here stands for both quantitative and qualitative structure-activity relationships. Here I would like to mention some advantages of the QSRs, such as, for example, they allow estimation of biological effect from chemical structure alone without need of other additional information. Or the models can serve themselves as a source of information on available data which might be included in their training set. The chemical structure could be described in various ways, and some most common descriptors include physico-chemical properties, such as partition or distribution coefficient, water solubility or vapor pressure, quantum mechanical indices, which are descriptors of the electronic structure of the chemicals, or graph-theoretical descriptors, such as connectivity or electrotopological indices. The function is either known a priori, for example, linear, quadratic, etc., or it is statistically derived from one or more descriptors by using of different modeling techniques. And here I would like to show one classical example for linear QSER model. It is developed by the QSER toolbox, but could be derived also by other tools. Because we use the toolbox, I would like to mention that it's publicly available tool. It is free for download and can be installed on a PC. So you can use the opportunity from it in preparation of your registration dossiers. Coming back to the QSER model, here we start with a substance for which we have a data gap, which is in the red circle. The first step of developing a trend or simple QSER model is to find analogs which are similar to the query chemical in some respect. For this, we use a series of profilers available in the toolbox. It is important that the analogs which we select contain experimental data for the endpoint in which we are interested in. So in our case, we're interested in acute aquatic toxicity, and we collected measured data for LC50 to fish. The second step is to plot the endpoint of interest against appropriate physical, chemical, or other property. And in this case, we selected octanol water partitioning coefficient because we know that the penetration of the substances in the body of the fish depends on their hydrophobicity. Thus, we can fit a mathematical function, which is expressed by mathematical equation available above the graph. It's also visualized by the solid red line on the plot. The third and last step is, after we have a good function, and if we know the descriptor of a chemical which we want to predict, we can introduce this value in the model and predict the LC50 for this substance. Thus, we can fill a data gap. We'll come to this model later. Further, REACH allows the use of QSERs for prediction of different properties, such as physical, chemical, ecotoxicological, and environmental fate properties. Rarely, the results might be used instead of experimental data alone, and only if a number of conditions are met. These conditions are described in Annex 11 of REACH. In the majority of cases, however, the models would be used to provide supplementary information. And here we would like to give a general flavor for the use of QSERs by informal study which we performed at the end of last year. We looked at lead registrations and endpoint study records which use study result type QSER. So without particular order, you can see the top 10 endpoints for which QSERs were used. Most QSERs were used for prediction of partition coefficient, but also for other physical-chemical properties such as water solubility and vapor pressure. The QSERs were used also for prediction of acute aquatic toxicity and bioaccumulation. And the third group of properties that were highly predicted were the environmental fate properties, such as cell absorption, biodegradation in water, and phototransformation in air. The results of this study are not to be mixed with the results in the report called The Use of Alternatives to Testing on Animals for the REACH Regulation, which was developed and published on the ECHO website last year. This report really focuses on the use of alternatives as a replacement of animal testing. Going back to Rich, it says that results obtained from valid QCR models may indicate the presence or absence of a certain dangerous property. Presence could be predicted by both quantitative and qualitative models as structural alerts. Absence, however, can be predicted only by quantitative models which have been trained to discriminate between positive and negative results. Here I would like to say that for a number of endpoints, yes, no type of prediction is not sufficient to fulfill informational requirements and to fill data gap as requested by Rich Annexes 7 to 10. The results of QCR may be used instead of testing when the following conditions are met. These are described in Annex 11. Results are derived from QCR models whose scientific validity has been established. The substances fall within the applicability domain of the QCR. Results are adequate for the purpose of classification and labeling and/or risk assessment, and adequate and reliable documentation is provided. So we will go through these 4 points together in the next slides. The scientific validity of a model is assessed based on the OECD principles for validation of QCRs. There is no formal validation process of QCRs in terms of validation body and validation criteria. There is also no list of validated QCR models, so don't spend time to look for them, but the GRC QCR model database contains a collection of peer-reviewed models. Very often in practice, we assess the scientific validity of the model and their reliability based on the type of the QCR model, the endpoint that it intends to predict, the query substance, and the purpose for which it is used. Here, and I will cite basically the wording of the OECD principles. They say that in order to facilitate the consideration of a QCR model for regulatory purposes, it should be associated with the following information: a defined endpoint, an ambiguous algorithm, a defined domain of applicability, appropriate measure of goodness of fit, robustness, and predictivity, and mechanistic interpretation if possible. All these 5 principles are detailedly described in the Guidance on QCR and Grouping of Substances, which is Chapter R6 from the Guidance on Information Requirements under REACH. Going to the applicability domain, we understand that this is a difficult matter, and most often this is the problematic part of the characterization of the QCR model. The reasons for the difficulties are in the fact that there is no one single way that is sufficient to provide complete characterization of the applicability domain. Therefore, we recommend to our registrants and their consultants to look in more than one way to describe chemical structure space when deriving applicability domains. Ideally, and this is set in the guidance, the chemical structure space should be described by both structural and physical-chemical means. But please note, the descriptor space is not sufficient enough alone to judge on the model applicability domain. And the guidance also said that the response could be any physical, chemical, toxicological property or environmental effect. Well, another difficulty with the definition of the applicability domain is based on the fact that it relates to similarity between chemicals. Similarity is a relative concept, and the descriptors are only proxies of chemical structure. There are usually gaps in the descriptor space, That is why we should look also to describe the chemical structure in different ways. And for example, we can use functional groups, atom fragments, structural alerts, and other means in addition to the descriptors. Similarity indices are often used. They are considered useful but not a sufficient measure of similarity, and the mechanistic and the metabolic similarities are important too. And here is just one example on structure description depending on different structural concepts. This example was derived with the QCR toolbox, and I am not going to go into detail of the different ways of description of structure, but this is the role of the expert to decide which is the best way to describe chemical structure and similarity. To be used in the rich regulation, the QCR prediction should be adequate for the purpose. The adequacy is determined by the model validity and applicability to a given chemical, as well as to the model relevance for a regulatory purpose. So, on one hand, you have a QCR model, which should be scientific valid according to the 5 OECD principles which we discussed before. This model should be applicable to the query chemical, and if it is, it makes the result reliable. But this is not sufficient to be used instead of test result, so the result also should be adequate for the regulatory purpose and should predict a rich relevant endpoint in brief. When assessing the adequacy, we should keep in mind the principles of proportionality and the principle of caution. The principle of proportionality is about the relationship between the amount and quality of data needed and the severity of the decision to be made. For example, if you try to predict a physical-chemical property, which could be tested relatively cheap, fast, and without animals, you may need less information compared to endpoint, which is related, for example, to human health. And principle of caution is about the relationship between the amount and quality of data needed and the consequences of the decision based on that information being wrong. Or, in other words, the closer the prediction to a regulatory cutoff, the more information is needed to prove on which side of this cutoff the prediction is. In summary, the QCR result should be fit for purpose or adequate, as we discussed. And we have to know that the QCRs perform better on some endpoints than the others, and it shows in our statistical analysis. Last but not the least, the documentation of the QCR models is important for the ability to be evaluated the model. The information required to describe a QCR is driven by standard formats, which are given in the guidance on QCR and grouping. Here we distinguish a QCR model reporting format, or QMRF in brief, and QCR prediction reporting format, QPRF. The QCR model reporting format is related to the scientific validity of the model, as determined by the OECD principles, as well as to the relevance of the endpoint for each. While the QCR prediction reporting format is related to the applicability domain, or how good the model is in predicting that particular chemical, and also for the adequacy of the QCR prediction. Basically, to be able to evaluate a QCR prediction, we need both formats to be submitted. This could be either attached to an endpoint study record, or the information can be filled in the relevant Euclid fields. And how to do that, you can consult with the practical guide number 5, which is available from the ECHA website. Coming back to the example with the QCR toolbox. Once you develop a trend or model with which you're satisfied with, so it has good statistical fit, robustness, and predictivity, doesn't have outliers, and you think that you can use it for prediction, then you can accept the prediction, which opens a user interface as the one you see on the screen. It prompts explanation related to the general information for the model, as well as expert explanation about the endpoint, the algorithm, the domain, the data, and mechanistic interpretation. Finally, in the last step, the user can put the statement for the regulatory adequacy and relevance of the prediction made. After we fill all information required by the different tabs, we can save this information, which will print in QCR Toolbox prediction report. It contains both chemical and numerical information from the model itself. This information is pre-filled, so it can save time. And also contains information which was added manually in the previous step described. Thus, we have all QMRF and QPRF information in one format for convenience of the user. And to summarize the main points from these presentations, the results of the QCRs can be used instead of testing for certain endpoints and when a number of conditions are met. The development and use of the techniques is complex and often require adequate expertise. And also, not every model could be applied to every substance, so there is no unique QCR model, and you should consider the applicability domain and the scope of the model. The documentation part is important for regulatory evaluation. And finally, in cases where there is still uncertainty related to one or more information elements, the QCR results may still be used in weight of evidence approach. And this was my presentation. Here you can find links to documents and tools which I mentioned in my talk. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'd like now to summarize what we've covered in this webinar today. We've covered 3 subject matters, so let me just set out some of the key messages that come from these issues that have been addressed. First of all, weight of evidence adaptations to the standard information requirements. Some of the key points are that weight of evidence is a useful approach. It makes use of all available information for an endpoint, but it requires expert judgment, with every case being different, and that clear and transparent documentation and argumentation is required. For in vitro methods, we've covered how in vitro methods can be used in a reach context, and it depends on applicability and validation status. You have the possibility of fulfilling information requirements by using appropriate column 2 and Annex 11 adaptations, but it is important to follow ongoing developments for in vitro methods, because new methods are introduced frequently and they can be very useful. For QSAR, these are well-established methodologies, and we know that these can be used instead of testing for certain endpoints when conditions are met. The development and use of the techniques is complex and requires expertise, and that those models should be scientifically valid and applicable to the relevant substance. The documentation of what you do, again, is a key issue for ECHA to be able to consider this in a regulatory context. I hope these are some of the key messages that you'll be able to pick up from the presentations this morning. ECHA's program of interacting with registrants is ongoing. There are further lead registrant webinars coming up. We have webinars on chemical safety assessment and QSAR coming up in April, and also in general principles of dossier submission and preparation in September. There are webinars open to everybody on substance identity and data sharing as a CEIF member in the next 2 months, and likewise on downstream user obligations in April. There will be another lead registrant workshop in the last half of the year, providing support and networking opportunities for lead registrants preparing for the 2013 deadline. And do stay tuned to the ECHA website to find out all the latest updates and subscribe to our e-news. Just in respect of the webinar today, you should stop submitting questions at 1 o'clock. So that's in about half an hour's time. The questions will be answered to the question and answer panel until 2 o'clock. So that's another hour and a half. And panelists will continue to provide individual answers. Do not log off yet, because panelists will continue to answer till 2 o'clock. For questions that will be answered by phone, the panelists will provide you with a time slot, and those telephone conversations will begin at the end of the webinar. If the question goes on to the help desk, then you should receive an acknowledgement of receipt and an answer within 15 working days. Let me also mention that once the event finishes, you will be directed to a survey, and we'd be grateful if you fill that out, because it's very important that we learn what you find useful and important and relevant in these seminars, so that we can make these more relevant for you in the future. So it would be grateful if you could fill that out and get back to us. Thank you very much for your attention, and that concludes the webinar